Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air on Southern Boulevard in the Bronx, on the night of March 24, 1990, was thick with the promise of spring and the lingering energy of a Saturday. It was a place of brick and concrete, of bodegas with glowing signs, and the distant rumble of the elevated train that sliced through the borough, a steel river carrying the city's lifeblood. Life here was lived on the margins, a tapestry woven from the threads of 100 different homelands, each person chasing a sliver of the American dream that seemed to shine brightest and most elusively from across the East River in Manhattan. For the vibrant Honduran community that called this part of the Bronx home, Saturday night was a sacred ritual. It was a chance to shed the uniforms of dishwashers, factory workers, and cleaning crews, and to step into a space that felt like their own, a temporary reprieve from a world that often felt indifferent, if not hostile. That space, on this particular night, was the Happy Land Social Club. From the outside, it was just another unassuming two-story building at 1959 Southern Boulevard. There was no grand marquee, no velvet rope. Its name was hand-painted, almost an afterthought, on a plain sign above a recessed doorway next to a shuttered storefront. But inside, up a single, narrow staircase, the world transformed. The air pulsed with the rhythms of salsa, punta, and merengue, the bass thumping a collective heartbeat for the more than 100 people packed onto the dance floor. The language was Spanish, the laughter was universal, and the cheap decorations, crepe paper streamers and plastic flowers, seemed to glitter like crystal under the dim lights. This wasn't just a club, it was a sanctuary. It was a piece of San Pedro Sula, of Tegucigalpa, transplanted to the cold concrete of New York. It was a place to celebrate a birthday, to forget a week of hard labor, to find a familiar face, to fall in love. But outside, in the cool night air, a different kind of energy was building. It was a bitter, solitary heat, fueled not by music and community, but by rejection and a profound sense of wounded pride. It was the fury of one man, Julio Gonzalez. His world had just been upended, not by some grand tragedy, but by a simple, humiliating argument with his ex-girlfriend inside that very club. As the bouncer shoved him out onto the sidewalk, the vibrant sounds from upstairs became a mocking echo of the life he felt he was being locked out of. He stood there for a moment, the sounds of joy filtering down to him, and a vow formed in the toxic crucible of his mind. He would shut this place down. No one inside heard his threat. They were lost in the music, in the embrace of a dance partner, in the foam of a cheap beer. They were blissfully unaware that a simple domestic dispute on the sidewalk below was about to metastasize into an event of national horror. They could not know that Julio Gonzalez was walking away, not in defeat, but on a mission that would require a discarded plastic container and $1 worth of regular unleaded gasoline. The forces that would collide in the next hour were tragically mismatched. The collective joy of a community against the singular, focused rage of one man. And the structure that housed them all, the Happy Land Social Club, was itself a silent accomplice, a death trap waiting for a spark. Its illegality and its flagrant disregard for safety, the very conditions that would make the unthinkable possible. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a crime of passion. We explore how an intimate personal fury, the kind that plays out in countless relationships every day, can become a weapon of mass destruction. We will examine the timeline of a single night, tracing the steps from a lover's quarrel to a national tragedy, and uncover how Julio Gonzalez, A man seeking to reclaim his power over one person ended up extinguishing the lives of 87. To understand the scale of the Happy Land tragedy, we must first understand the place itself. The club was not a legitimate business in the eyes of the city. It was an illegal social club, one of hundreds that dotted the outer boroughs of New York. These establishments operated in a legal gray area, often without proper licenses, serving as vital community hubs for immigrant populations. They were places to find familiar food, music, and language, a shield against the alienation of a new country. They offered a taste of home for a few dollars, a price that seemed like a bargain. But this comfort came at a steep price, one paid not in cash but in safety. To avoid scrutiny from authorities, they often operated in buildings that were flagrantly, criminally unsafe. The building at 1959 Southern Boulevard was a textbook example, a disaster waiting to happen. The property was owned by a corporation controlled by Alex DiLorenzo III, a scion of a powerful New York real estate family. The building, however, was leased to a man named J. Weiss, the then husband of actress Kathleen Turner. Weiss's company, Little Peach Realty, was the club's landlord. For months, DiLorenzo and Weiss had been locked in a legal battle over the property. In the midst of this dispute, the city had taken notice of the building's dangerous conditions. On November 21, 1988, a full 16 months before the fire, the New York City Fire Department had issued a vacate order for the premises due to a lack of proper fire exits and other serious safety violations. That order was sent, it was filed, and then, tragically, it was forgotten. It was lost in a bureaucratic shuffle between city agencies, the owner and the leaseholder. No one followed up, no one enforced the closure, and the club, under the new name Happy Land, continued to pack in crowds every weekend. The anatomy of the building itself was a blueprint for disaster. There was only one public entrance and exit. The narrow 3-foot-wide staircase Julio Gonzalez had been thrown down. A second exit in the rear existed, but it was blocked, a door leading nowhere for the panicked patrons. The windows on the second floor, a potential last resort, were barred or covered with plywood. Inside there were no sprinklers. There were no fire alarms. There was no emergency lighting to pierce the inevitable darkness. The interior was a tinderbox of cheap, highly flammable materials, dark wood paneling on the walls, a suspended ceiling with acoustic tiles, and a floor covered in worn carpeting. And everywhere, there were those festive plastic and paper decorations, hanging from the ceiling like colorful fuses, ready to melt and drip fire onto the crowd below. The club's capacity was legally supposed to be under 50. On that night, it held well over 100 people. It wasn't just a fire code violation. It was a tomb in waiting. The people who gathered there on March 24th were not reckless thrill seekers. They were simply seeking community. The crowd was overwhelmingly young, mostly immigrants from Honduras, with a significant number hailing from the industrial city of San Pedro Sula. They were men and women in their late teens, 20s, and 30s, the backbone of New York's service economy. They worked punishingly long hours in low-wage jobs, sending what little money they could spare back to their families in remittances that supported entire households. The club was their reward, their release. For a few dollars, they could feel a sense of belonging that was often denied to them in the wider city. They were celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, or simply the end of another grinding week. They were brothers and sisters, cousins and lovers, friends and neighbors. Within hours, their names would become a grim roll call, their dreams incinerated alongside them. Their identities, so vibrant inside those walls, would be reduced to a number, 87. At the center of the storm was the relationship between Julio Gonzalez and Lydia Feliciano. Gonzalez, 36 years old, was a man whose life was marked by instability and resentment. Born in Cuba in 1954, he had a troubled history. He served in Fidel Castro's army in the 1970s, an experience that ended with him being jailed for desertion. In 1980, he joined the mass exodus known as the Mariel boat lift, when Castro opened the port of Mariel and allowed 125,000 Cubans to flee to the United States. The boat lift was a mixed blessing for the U.S. While many were legitimate refugees seeking freedom, Castro also used the opportunity to empty his prisons and mental institutions. This created a lasting stigma for the Marielitos, who were often stereotyped as criminals. For Gonzalez, life in America did not bring prosperity. He drifted between low-skilled jobs, never holding one for long. He had a prior arrest for drug possession. Just days before the fire, he had been laid off from his job at a lamp factory in Queens. His life was a long, slow slide into failure, and he carried that bitterness with him. His personality, as described by those who knew him, was a toxic mix of charm and menace. He could be friendly and outgoing, but he was also prone to fits of jealousy and rage. He was possessive of the women in his life, viewing them as property. Lydia Feliciano, 45, was the latest object of his obsession. She worked the coat check counter at Happy Land, a small booth at the bottom of the stairs leading to the main floor. Her job placed her at the club's very heart, and for Gonzalez, it was a source of constant torment. They had been in a tumultuous on-again, off-again relationship for several months. He was controlling, and she had recently tried to end it for good. He refused to accept it. In his mind, her job at the club, where she interacted with dozens of men every night, was a direct affront to his authority. The club, a place of joy for so many, became the symbol of his romantic failure and emasculation. On the night of March 24th, this toxic dynamic reached its breaking point. Gonzalez, stewing for 2 days after losing his job and drinking heavily, made his way to Happy Land. His goal was simple: to confront Lydia, to force her to come back to him. He found her at her post working the coat check. An argument erupted, loud and ugly. Eyewitnesses would later report hearing him plead, then demand, that she quit her job and leave with him immediately. He was insistent, his voice growing louder with every refusal. When she stood her ground, his pleading turned to threats. The specific words are lost to the chaos of memory, but the sentiment was clear and chillingly common in disputes of this nature. If he couldn't have her, no one could. He reportedly told her, "You will be sorry." The confrontation grew so heated that the club's bouncer intervened. Gonzalez was physically removed, manhandled down the stairs, and shoved out onto Southern Boulevard. The humiliation was absolute. He had been rejected by his lover and ejected from the community space in front of others. For a man whose self-worth was already so fragile, whose life was a litany of failures, this public shaming was the final push. Standing on the sidewalk, listening to the muffled sounds of the party continuing without him, his despair curdled into a cold, homicidal rage. He shouted back towards the door, a threat that was likely dismissed as the empty bluster of a drunken, heartbroken man. "I'll be back. I'm going to shut this place down." The distance between a threat and its execution is often vast. For most, anger cools and reason prevails. But Julio Gonzalez was not most people. His walk away from the club was not a retreat. It was a journey toward his horrific purpose. He walked a few blocks through the late-night streets of the Bronx to an Amoco gas station on Boston Road. There, he had a calm, unremarkable transaction with the attendant. He asked for a small amount of gasoline. The attendant, noticing he had no proper gas can, initially refused, citing safety rules. But Gonzalez was persistent. He left, found a discarded plastic container nearby, and returned. This time, the attendant, likely a young man working a dangerous overnight shift and wanting to avoid a confrontation over a single dollar, relented. He filled the container with $1 worth of regular unleaded gasoline. This moment is a crucial part of the crime's anatomy. The purchase of the accelerant was not a frantic, impulsive act. It required a walk, a search for a container, a negotiation, a return trip. It was a sequence of deliberate choices made over a period of perhaps 20 or 30 minutes. This was not a cooling-off period. It was a period of hardening resolve. With each step, with each decision, he moved further from the realm of emotional outburst and deeper into the territory of premeditated murder. Holding the container of gasoline, he turned and began the walk back to 1959 Southern Boulevard. The party inside was reaching its peak. It was now after 3 a.m. on Sunday morning, March 25th. The music was loud. The dancers were tireless. No one had any idea that death, in the form of a man with a plastic jug, was walking methodically toward their door. Gonzalez arrived back at the club. The recessed doorway was empty. The bouncer was likely back inside. He didn't hesitate. He unscrewed the cap and began sloshing the gasoline across the floor of the small entryway and onto the base of the staircase. He then pulled the metal roll-down gate partially down, not to lock people in, but seemingly to block the view from the street and perhaps to contain the initial blast. Lydia Feliciano, still working at her coat-check booth just inside, saw him. A flash of terror must have shot through her. She likely had only a second to process what was happening before he was finished. He pulled 2 matches from his pocket. The first one failed to light, its head crumbling. He struck the second one. It sparked to life. He tossed it onto the fuel-soaked floor. The result was not a slow-burning fire. It was an explosion, a phenomenon known as a flashover, or more accurately, a fuel-air explosion. The gasoline vaporized in the enclosed space of the entryway, creating a highly combustible mixture. The lit match ignited this cloud, and a fireball erupted, roaring up the narrow staircase as if it were a chimney. The fire consumed the oxygen in the stairwell in seconds, creating a superheated toxic plume of black smoke and carbon monoxide that billowed into the crowded club on the second floor with incredible velocity and force. For the people inside, the transition from celebration to catastrophe was instantaneous. One moment they were dancing. The next, the lights went out, and a wave of thick, acrid smoke, impossibly hot and impossibly fast, poured into the room. Panic erupted. The music died, replaced by a wave of screams. The single exit, the staircase, was now an impassable blowtorch of flame and smoke. The layout of the club became a deadly maze. In the pitch-black, smoke-filled chaos, people became disoriented. They pushed toward where they thought the exit was, only to find a wall of heat and fire that drove them back. The speed of the fire was staggering. The flammable decorations melted and rained down fire. The wood paneling and acoustic tiles ignited, releasing a lethal cocktail of chemicals. Temperatures inside likely soared to over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit in minutes. But it wasn't the heat that claimed most of the victims. It was the smoke. The combustion of the building's synthetic materials, the upholstery, the paneling, the plastics, released carbon monoxide, cyanide, and other toxic gases. Inhaling this smoke would have caused disorientation, then unconsciousness, then death, all within a matter of minutes, sometimes seconds. Downstairs, Lydia Feliciano and a handful of others who were near the entrance, the club's DJ, the bouncer, a few patrons, managed to escape in the initial seconds after the ignition. They scrambled out into the street, gasping for air, their ears ringing from the roar of the fire. But for everyone on the second floor, escape was impossible. Their desperate struggle for life was later etched into the scene. Firefighters would find them piled several deep against the blocked rear exit. They would find them huddled together in corners under tables, husbands shielding wives, brothers shielding sisters. Of the 87 who died, 21 were found on the dance floor. The majority, however, were found to have died peacefully from carbon monoxide poisoning. Frozen in their final moments, many were still in their seats or standing at the bar, as if they had simply been overcome where they stood, a glass still in their hand. The anatomy of their deaths was cruelly swift and silent, a mass asphyxiation in the dark. Julio Gonzalez did not stay to watch the consequences of his actions. As the fireball erupted, he simply turned and walked away into the night. Leaving the screams and the soon-to-be-arriving sirens behind him, he went back to his shabby apartment, turned on the television, and watched the first news reports of a fire at a social club in the Bronx. He watched as the body count began to climb from a few to a dozen to scores. He knew what he had done. He later left his apartment and went to a friend's home, where he confessed, reportedly, in a calm, matter-of-fact tone. The devil, he claimed, had made him do it. The first call to the New York City Fire Department came in at 3:26 a.m. The firehouse for Engine 82 and Ladder 31 was only a few blocks away. They arrived on the scene in under 3 minutes. What they found was an apocalypse. Flames were blowing out of the second-story windows with the force of a jet engine, and an impenetrable column of black smoke was pouring from the single entrance. The heat was so intense it buckled the steel roll-down gate that Gonzalez had partially closed. The firefighters knew immediately that this was a major, life-threatening blaze. They also knew, from the sheer volume of fire at the front of the building, that anyone on the second floor was in grave danger. The initial attack was brutal. Firefighters had to force their way through the narrow doorway, directly into the heart of the blaze that was still raging on the staircase. They were met with a wall of heat and zero visibility. As they battled their way up the stairs with a hose line, the first horrifying discoveries were made. They began to trip over bodies on the smoke-filled second floor. The scene that confronted the veteran firefighters of the FDNY was described as one of the most horrific they had ever witnessed, a silent, smoke-stained tableau of death. The party clothes, the festive decorations now melted and charred, stood in grotesque contrast to the reality of the room. One firefighter would later recall the eerie silence, the absence of screams, indicating that death had come quickly and completely. It was immediately obvious to the fire marshals who arrived on the scene that this was no accident. The telltale signs of arson were unmistakable. The specific pattern of the burn, concentrated at the single point of egress, and the overwhelming pungent odor of a liquid accelerant pointed directly to a deliberately set fire. The investigation began while the building was still smoldering. This was not just a fire investigation. It was now the largest mass murder investigation in the city's history. The New York Police Department dispatched a massive contingent of detectives. The crime scene was sprawling and complex, but in the midst of the chaos and tragedy, They got the single most important break in the case almost immediately. They found the survivors. Among them was a distraught and terrified Lydia Feliciano. She had seen who set the fire. She told the police everything about her ex-boyfriend, Julio Gonzalez, their volatile relationship, the argument that night, his threats, and finally, the sight of him splashing liquid at the door just before the world exploded. Her account was the Rosetta Stone for the investigation. Suddenly, the investigation had a laser focus. It had a name, a face, and a motive. A citywide manhunt was launched for Julio Gonzalez. Police broadcast his description and plastered his photo across the city. They knew he was their man. The only questions were where he was and how quickly they could get to him. The search, however, was surprisingly short. Gonzalez had not fled the city. He had not gone into hiding. After confessing to his friend, he had simply gone to sleep. When detectives, acting on a tip, arrived at the address on the afternoon of Sunday, March 25th, less than 12 hours after the fire, they found him there. He was described as being surprisingly calm, almost detached. His shoes were singed, and he smelled faintly of gasoline. He offered no resistance. At the 48th Precinct Station House, Julio Gonzalez confessed to Detective William Scarangello. His account, given over several hours, was chilling in its simplicity and its profound lack of remorse. He admitted to the argument with Lydia. He admitted to being thrown out of the club. He admitted to buying the gasoline and setting the fire. He seemed unable or unwilling to connect his personal grievance with Lydia to the deaths of 86 other people. His focus remained entirely on her. He claimed he didn't intend to kill anyone, that he only wanted to shut the place down and scare her. In his warped perception, the 87 victims were merely collateral damage in his personal drama. His confession provided investigators with everything they needed. They had the eyewitness, the motive, the physical evidence of accelerant, and now a full confession from the perpetrator himself. The arrest of Julio Gonzalez brought a name and a face to the horror, but it did little to quell the grief and rage that swept through the Bronx. The Honduran community was shattered. Entire families had been wiped out. The dead were so numerous that the city's morgue was overwhelmed, and a temporary facility had to be set up at the Bendix building. For days, grieving relatives endured the agonizing process of identifying their loved ones from photographs, their worst fears confirmed one by one. Mass funerals were held, with caskets lining the aisles of St. Thomas Aquinas Church, a devastating visual testament to the scale of the loss. The tragedy resonated far beyond New York, sending a shockwave of grief back to the towns and villages in Honduras from which the victims had come. The fire also served as a brutal wake-up call for the city of New York. It cast a harsh spotlight on the dangerous and unregulated world of illegal social clubs. Mayor David Dinkins, facing immense public pressure, ordered an immediate and sweeping crackdown. A special task force of 200 fire, police, and building inspectors was formed. In the weeks and months that followed, they raided and shuttered hundreds of similar establishments across the 5 boroughs, uncovering a citywide pattern of life-threatening fire code violations. The Happy Land fire, born of one man's personal rage, became the catalyst for a systemic overhaul of public safety enforcement. It was a classic case of reactive policymaking, a reform written in ashes and paid for with 87 lives. The legal proceedings against Julio Gonzalez began swiftly. He was charged with 174 counts of murder, 2 for each of the 87 victims. under the legal theories of both intentional murder and murder by depraved indifference to human life. He was also charged with multiple counts of arson and assault. The prosecution, led by Bronx District Attorney Robert T. Johnson, had an ironclad case. They had Lydia Feliciano's eyewitness testimony, Gonzalez's detailed confession, and the damning forensic evidence from the fire marshals. The central legal question was not whether he did it, but what his mental state was at the time. His defense team, led by court-appointed lawyers Richard and Ira Furlong, pursued the only viable strategy they had, an affirmative defense of extreme emotional disturbance. This is the legal underpinning of what is colloquially known as a crime of passion defense. The argument was that Gonzalez was not legally responsible for murder because the humiliation of being rejected by Lydia and thrown out of the club caused him to snap, to lose control of his reason, and to act in a blind rage without comprehending the catastrophic consequences. If successful, this defense could have reduced the murder charges to manslaughter. They presented psychiatric experts who testified that Gonzalez suffered from a personality disorder and was in a dissociative state when he set the fire. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Eric Warner, countered this narrative forcefully. They portrayed Gonzalez not as a man who had lost his mind, but as a deeply narcissistic and vengeful individual who had made a series of deliberate choices. They meticulously walked the jury through his actions that night. The walk to the gas station, the procurement of a container, the transaction with the attendant, the walk back to the club, the use of 2 matches when the first one failed. These were not the actions of a man in a blind, unthinking rage. They were the methodical steps of a man bent on revenge. They argued that his motive was clear and coherent. He wanted to punish Lydia Feliciano and destroy the place that represented her independence from him. The 87 other people in the club were not accidental victims. Their deaths were a foreseeable and therefore intended consequence of an act of supreme and depraved indifference to human life. The trial lasted for weeks, and the testimony was harrowing. Firefighters described the horrific scene inside the club. Survivors, including Lydia Feliciano, recounted the final moments of celebration before the chaos. Family members of the victims filled the courtroom, their grief a constant palpable presence. Through it all, Julio Gonzalez remained largely impassive, a blank figure at the center of a vortex of suffering he had created. On August 19, 1991, the jury delivered its verdict. They rejected the defense's claims of extreme emotional disturbance. They found Julio Gonzalez guilty on all counts, including 87 counts of arson and 174 counts of murder. The verdict affirmed the prosecution's view. This was not an act of temporary insanity, but a calculated act of mass murder driven by jealousy and rage. A month later, at his sentencing, Judge Burton B. Roberts delivered a scathing condemnation of Gonzalez and his crime. Looking directly at the defendant, he called the fire an unspeakably vicious, cowardly, and evil act. He made it clear that Gonzalez would receive the maximum penalty the law allowed. He sentenced him to 25 years to life for each of the 87 murder victims, with the sentences to be served consecutively. The total sentence amounted to a staggering 2,175 years in prison, ensuring that Julio Gonzalez would die behind bars. It was one of the longest prison sentences ever handed down in the United States. Gonzalez was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, where he would spend the next quarter century. He died in custody of a heart attack on September 13, 2016, at the age of 61. The legacy of the Happy Land fire is multifaceted. For the city of New York, it was a brutal lesson in the importance of fire safety and regulatory enforcement. The crackdown on illegal social clubs undoubtedly saved lives, forcing a dangerous shadow economy into the light. The phrase Happy Land became synonymous with fire trap, a cautionary tale invoked whenever issues of building codes and public safety are discussed. It stands as a grim monument to the dangers that can fester in the margins of a city, where vulnerable communities are often forced to choose between community and safety. The building itself was demolished shortly after the fire, leaving an empty lot that for decades served as a constant, silent reminder of the tragedy that occurred there. For the families of the victims, the passage of time has done little to dull the pain. The fire left a permanent scar on the Honduran-American community, a generational trauma born from a single night of unimaginable loss. Memorials were erected, and for years, on the anniversary of the fire, the corner of Southern Boulevard and East Tremont Avenue became a place of pilgrimage, a site for grieving relatives to remember the vibrant young people whose lives were so senselessly stolen. But it is the core anatomy of the crime itself that remains the most chilling aspect of the Happy Land case. This was not the work of a sophisticated criminal enterprise, a terrorist cell, or a deranged serial killer meticulously planning his actions over years. It was the result of a common, almost mundane human failing, the inability of one man to accept rejection. Julio Gonzalez's rage was not extraordinary. It was the garden variety possessiveness and wounded pride that fuels countless domestic disputes every day. What made it catastrophic was the confluence of that ordinary rage with an extraordinarily vulnerable target. The Happy Land Social Club, with its single exit, its flammable decor, and its lack of safety features, a result of both the operator's negligence and the city's bureaucratic failure, acted as an amplifier for his malice. It transformed a container of gasoline from a tool for simple arson into the ignition for a weapon of mass destruction. The crime reveals the terrifyingly thin membrane that separates private grievance from public tragedy. It demonstrates how a personal, intimate conflict, when placed in the right, or rather, the horribly wrong set of circumstances, can escalate with exponential speed and lethality. The entire event, from the argument to the arrest, unfolded in less than 24 hours. The act itself, from lighting the match to sealing the fate of everyone inside, took only seconds. This case forces us to confront a difficult truth about the nature of evil. It is not always a monstrous, otherworldly force. Sometimes it is profoundly, terrifyingly human. Julio Gonzalez was not a mastermind. He was a failed, resentful man whose final desperate attempt to assert control over one woman resulted in the obliteration of 87 other lives. His motive was as petty as his method was brutal. The unique anatomy of this crime lies in that terrible imbalance, the triviality of the cause and the enormity of the effect. The 87 men and women who died in the Happy Land Social Club were not the intended targets of Julio Gonzalez's rage, but they were not entirely accidental either. They were simply in the way of his vengeance. They were the anonymous backdrop to his personal psychodrama, their lives erased to make a point to an audience of one. Their deaths serve as the ultimate horrific testament to the destructive power of a single, unchecked human emotion. They were not killed by a complex plot or a grand conspiracy, but by a simple dollar's worth of gasoline, wielded by a man whose broken heart had curdled into an all-consuming fire. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.